Of the 6 Somerville brothers, my brother Billy is by far the coolest. It doesn't hurt that he is 17 years younger than I am, which would make him, really young. He's been living in Denver for the past year, but he called last week to let me know that he has found an apartment in New York City. It's tiny, he said, but it is just one subway stop away from the school where he will be pursuing graduate studies in psychology. It's expensive, he said, but sharing it with 3 other students will cut down on the cost. It's in Brooklyn, he said, but I could hear the joy in his voice as he said it. For my brother Billy, riding a crowded subway into the city of Manhattan day after day, reading psychology textbooks in some dimly lit bohemian coffee shop in Soho, and living in some cramped apartment under the Brooklyn Bridge is just about as close to heaven as you can get. He's always been like that. I remember when he called to let me know that he was dropping out of school to become a professional musician. He was living with some friends in Atlanta at the time and working at Starbucks to pay the bills. But then he got a gig at this new church downtown, and before you know it, he was on staff as the worship leader at Trinity Vineyard, Atlanta, where he led the band and played guitar and sang these beautiful praise songs every Sunday night. It was almost like a real job. I got to visit the church once when I was in Atlanta for a conference, and I was impressed not only by the kinds of people who came through the door with their tattoos and nose rings and purple hair, but also by their young pastor, who talked to them about Jesus and did it in their own language so that I could hardly understand what he was talking about. I kept leaning over to my brother Billy and saying, what does he mean? What did he say? What was that? So that I began to feel less and less like his brother, more and more like his grandpa. When I talked to the pastor after the service, he told me that one of the hard things about doing church in a city like Atlanta is building community. Because people are scattered all over the place and they seem to be busy all the time. In those days before everybody was on Facebook, he was trying to build virtual community on the church website by asking questions and letting the members post their answers on something called a bulletin board. One of the questions he asked was, how is Trinity different from the church you attended as a child? And the answers were interesting. Few of their members came from liturgical churches, Anglican and Catholic, and what they missed at Trinity was the pipe organ music, the acolytes, the high church hymns, the candlelight. Some of their members had come from uptight Protestant churches where you couldn't sneeze unless it was in the bulletin, and they didn't seem to miss much of anything. They liked the drums and guitars, the come-as-you-are spirit of worship at Trinity. But most of their members, most of them, hadn't come from any church at all. Trinity was their first experience of Christian community. And when I asked the pastor what that was like, he said, these people don't even know what the word church means. I'm having to introduce a whole new concept. Which is exactly where the pastors of those first century churches found themselves. New Testament scholar Ralph Martin claims that the purpose of the letter to the Ephesians was to show the nature of the church and the Christian life to those who came to Christ from a pagan heritage and environment. Like Atlanta. They needed to know what the church was and what a Christian was supposed to be. And the writer of Ephesians set out to show them. In that first chapter, he explained how it had been part of God's plan from the very beginning to have something like the church. and how He sent His Son to gather up a group of people on whom He could pour out every blessing in heaven. Do you remember the image I left you with at the end of chapter 1? All of us standing out there on the sidewalk, barefoot, dripping wet, still wearing our baptismal robes, our mouths hanging open in stunned amazement at all God had given us. He's given everything He has to give. But in the second chapter of Ephesians, the writer addresses one of the first problems faced by that early church. God had been good. God had poured out His blessings. But God had poured out His blessings on Gentiles as well as Jews, and the Jews were having a little trouble with that. You may remember the story I told you about standing in that church during that Baptist associational meeting, having to share a hymn book with my worst enemy in that association. Imagine that kind of thing going on every Sunday in church, on every pew, Jews and Gentiles having to share hymn books with each other. The writer of Ephesians had to inform both groups that Christ Himself had broken down the dividing wall of hostility between them, created in Himself one new humanity instead of two. Where before there had been Jew and Gentile, now there was only Christian. And that's as true in our time as it was in His. In this church, too, Christ has broken down dividing walls of hostility so that people who could never get along out there in the world can get along here in the church. Christ Himself is our peace. But that's not enough for this writer. He doesn't want us to just get along. He wants us to be family. And if we are going to speak of the church as family, we are going to have to acknowledge that the Word has fallen on hard times. I knew a pastor in North Carolina who refused to use that word to describe his congregation for just that reason. He said, "You won't hear me talking about the church family. Not with all the dysfunction in the typical family, not with all the stony silences and shouting matches that make up the modern American home." He preferred to speak of the church as a community. And at first hearing, it sounds like a good solution to the problem. The word community doesn't carry the same negative connotations that family sometimes does. A community is simply a group of people who have something in common. We talk about the business community, the academic community, the community of faith. It's a good solution until you begin to talk about what it is that we as Christians have in common. And what we have is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, as the writer of this letter will say in chapter 4. If we really do have the same Father, then doesn't that make us family? I think it does. And I'm not alone in that thinking. The one who taught His disciples to pray, "Our Father," spawned a generation of believers who referred to each other as brother and sister. In the book of Acts, Luke tells us that they shared with each other, provided for one another's needs. Paul writes to the brethren in the various churches and greets them always with grace and peace from God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. When you read the New Testament even casually, you can see that the prevailing metaphor for the church is the metaphor of family. And when family is at its best, there is no better word. But what do you do when family is not at its best? What if the family you grew up in or the family in which you now find yourself is so hard-edged and hurtful that to use that word about the church makes you want to run screaming in the other direction? Then what? Well, let me ask you to do this. Rather than allowing your experience of family to taint this word, hold it up in front of the promise of what the church might be.